I'm Phil Drew. I'm president of the Historical Society, the sponsor of this meeting this evening. And we start this meeting, which is the annual meeting, which we postponed from December, with a short business meeting. And the purpose of that meeting is to elect officers and members of the board of directors. Let me see. Can you put that thing up on the screen? I'm sorry? Of course. Oh, that's very kind of you. So, we have a slate of officers, myself as president, Jack Trost as vice president, Annie Lutman as secretary, and Amy Jolie as our treasurer. And then the board of directors are the names that you see up there. And all of the officers are also members of the board of directors. So I'm going to ask for a vote of the members present here. Everybody who's contributed to the Historical Society is considered a member, and I would bet a nickel every one of you has contributed to the society. So I'm going to ask for a vote before I ask for a vote, if there are any nominations from the floor. Hearing none, we'll proceed, and I'm going to ask for a vote by acclamation. All in favor of this slate as presented, please say aye. Anyone opposed? Good. It carries by a unanimous vote. I'd like to tell you a little bit about the society right now. We have, fortunately, a very active board, and I'm as president, very grateful to the people who have devoted time and effort to various undertakings, and I'm looking forward to working with them in the year to come. Just this afternoon, we had a beautiful new sign erected on the edge of our property along the road, which I invite you all to drive by and take a look. It's three-dimensional and is quite spectacular, I think. And you've probably noticed our big banner up on the side of the barn, because we are still celebrating our, since 1933, our 50th anniversary, and which is remarkable. Why do I want to say 90th, shouldn't I? Yes. Sometimes I don't say things like that right. Well, I don't think I have anything to add, and so we can proceed to hear from our illustrious speakers.
Thank you. Okay, so welcome everybody. This is our second time around with this popular lecture, so I'm glad we have a good crowd here tonight, and we do welcome you. We're happy to have Historic New England back in Carlisle once again. Our first speaker this evening is Wendy Hubbard, and she's an art historian, museum administrator, educator, and interpreter. Wendy's been with Historic New England for 15 years and is the Gropius House, which is the museum, one of their Historic New England's museums in Lincoln. And she's the site manager there. She also oversees 4 historic homes, 2 in Lincoln, 1 in Cambridge, and 1 in Watertown. So Wendy is going to discuss the iconic Gropius House and the history of the Bauhaus Design School. We're equally thrilled to have Debbie with us again. Debbie resides in Carlisle, for those who didn't know. She's a British registered architect, writer, and educator. Debbie has collaborated with Wendy for our previous lecture, and it worked out beautifully. And she'll follow Wendy and discuss how Carlisle's modern and deck houses have been influenced by the Bauhaus design principles. So lastly, I just wanted to make a comment about Walter Gropius and the Gropius house. He designed and built the iconic house in 1938. He was the founder of the Bauhaus School of Modern Design in Germany. And he was described as one of the most influential architects of the 20th century. So I think you're going to enjoy the lecture, and Wendy will start.
Thank you, Donna. Thank you for inviting me back. Delighted to present the Walter Gropius house to you. Do we have any adjustment on light at all in this space, or no? Behind me. I'm just going to see if the one by the screen maybe, does that give it a little clarity on the screen? Excellent. So thank you, Donna. My name is Wendy Hubbard, as you probably know, site manager for the Walter Gropius house in Lincoln, Mass. And Historic New England, if you would put up the next slide, is the oldest, largest preservation organization in the country. We own and operate 38 historic properties around New England. Oh, okay, that's all right. We're good. There it is. There's our little logo. So education, interpretation, preservation is primarily our mission. And so I invite you to come and visit one of our sites in the near future. Mine, of course, are the best. Gropius House, the Codman Estate, the oldest house in Cambridge, Cooper, Frost, Austin, and one of the oldest houses in Watertown, 1698. And the new side, 1730, is for rent to a special crazy person who doesn't mind living in this funky historic space. So put it out there. If you know anybody that wants to rent a house in Watertown, I've got one. All right, so we'll take on the next slide and introduce you to not 1698, but 1938. And here is Walter Gropius, his family home in Lincoln, Massachusetts. Walter Gropius came to Lincoln in 1937 after an interval between 1934 and 1937 in London. As you may know from European history, as the Nazis rose to power in the 1930s, they characterized progressive thinking artists and others as degenerate, communist, and un-German. And so it was this Nazi rise to power that really created, to a certain degree, the Bauhaus diaspora. Many of the Bauhauslers left, including Walter Gropius. And while in London, he was working with a very prominent and leading modernists there, Maxwell Fry. He was working with a guy named Jack Pritchard at Isicon. And so it's a name-dropping tour, and if you don't know the names, it's not going to matter to the material points that I'm making. If you do, excellent. Happy to have such scholars in the audience. But what we're going to talk about primarily is how they got here to Lincoln. So it was in London that Joseph Hudnut, the dean of Harvard School of Architecture, recruited Walter Gropius to come to teach here in Cambridge. And to a certain degree, that was a lifeline in 1937 in Europe with the political stability unknown. So here we have the Gropius family home at the crest of a hill. We'll take on the next slide, please. Here is the Bauhaus today. It's it's a World Heritage Site. Gropius was able to design and build all of the structures on the Bauhaus site in Dessau because the city of Dessau recruited the school and paid for it and basically supported it financially. And the Bauhaus was about interdisciplinary collaboration with regards to art, architecture, and design. And one of the things that Gropius brought with him from his Bauhaus years and fostered this idea of collaboration throughout his life is exactly that, teamwork. And so you're going to hear a bit about TAC, the Architects Collaborative, which is going to connect right back to your hometown here of Carlisle. So we have the Bauhaus structures here in front of us, and Gropius's basic principles of architecture in terms of what you see here are simplicity and geometry, functionality, economy of means, and the building materials as the aesthetic. And so keep those characteristics in mind when we move over to Lincoln, Massachusetts. He synthesizes those ideas with traditional New England architecture. We'll see how that comes out. So next slide, please. The Bauhaus was one of those places that encouraged women to study sort of non-traditional disciplines as well. And I just happen to like this slide. We'll move on. Some of those names I'm going to drop are women's names. And here's one of them. Top left, excuse me, Marion Brandt was one of the women that sort of bucked the trend of it, you know, to a certain degree, as progressive as the Bauhaus was, it was a sort of part of its time, and they would encourage women to do, you know, nice things like weaving and photography and clean things like, you know, sort of ceramics and graphic design. And Marion Brandt said, no, I think I'm going to just go in the metal workshop. And so she did, and ultimately was the basically the master, is what they called them, of the metal workshop. Marion Brandt is her name. Underneath Marion Brandt here, lower left, is Walter and Isa Gropius. Isa, an equal and important partner in Walter Gropius's life, in his personal life and his professional life, and a big part of the success of the Bauhaus School. She was the PR department, and her nickname was Mrs. Bauhaus. Top right is Marcel Breuer, better known as an architect, was an instructor at the Bauhaus School in Germany, and was in charge of the furniture workshop. So you may know his Breuer chair, you're going to see plenty of them tonight, as an icon of mid-century modern design, almost ubiquitous today. And lower right is one of the either parties or theatrical productions of the Bauhaus. Parties figured very prominently in the Bauhaus experience. It was a very diverse and creative group of people that Gropius recruited to the Bauhaus, and sometimes there was some tension and people didn't get along. And so he'd say, I'm putting my foot down and we're throwing a party. And those parties had wonderful themes like a material or a shape or whatever. So Bauhaus music and theatrical design, costumes, and so forth. So lots of fun at the Bauhaus School as well. Next slide. And all that fun, you know, of course, came to that crashing halt when the Nazis rose to power. But before we get to that point, he also designed not only the school buildings and the workshops of the Bauhaus campus, but also this is the director's house, and he built the instructors' dwellings as well. And very often they were roommates, like Vasily Kandinsky and Paul Klee were roommates in their own house. So keep this in mind, this very simple shoebox shape, the large expanse of glass, and this simple plinth, this very flat plane on which the structure sits, because that's going to come into play when we come to our Lincoln House. So go ahead and swap that slide again. And again, this 1934, 1937, the Gropiuses were kind of in between, so 1 foot in Europe and 1 foot in the United States. I remember at some point in graduate school, I had like 4 W-2s, you know, like work cobbling together, you know, an income. And that was, to a certain degree, the Gropius' experience here in London. They had left their personal belongings behind in Berlin. Their daughter, Ati, came to live with them in London, but it was really a kind of a collage of employment for Walter Gropius. He also recruited some of his unemployed Bauhausler pals to come and design for Isokon, for example. Next slide. So here they are, relieved and happy on the front porch of their little rental house on Sandy Pond Road in Lincoln. It's actually still there, and it's just up the street from the DeCordova Museum driveway, if you know Sandy Pond in that neighborhood. And Isa, you see here on the right, in her memoirs said, you know, our Bauhaus furniture looked kind of odd in this quaint little colonial New England house, and we needed to build our own house. And so they did. Next slide. Oh, well, before we get to that one, so Gropius came to teach at Harvard University. He was the chairperson of the Graduate School of Design, otherwise known as GSD, in architecture up until 1952. Very often he would commission artists to collaborate with architects to create beautiful murals and other kinds of art in this building. So this is actually Harkness Commons with a mural behind him. So next slide. Excellent. So here is on the top left the Gropius property. Now, Dean Hudnut was an acquaintance of Helen Storrow. Now, Helen Storrow's country home is now the Carroll School, also on Baker Bridge Road, and she owned all that land that stretches from the Carroll School down to Concord Road, and so as her farmland. So this was an active, busy, full apple orchard of Helen Storrow's. Now, Mrs. Storrow was introduced to the Gropiuses through the Dean of Harvard, and her activities in terms of immigration were that basically, let's give people the material foundation to put down roots and succeed here in the United States. She also worked with the Girl Scouts of America and the Saturday Evening Girls in the North End, and she worked with the Gropius family to put down their roots, because while they were able to get their furniture out of Nazi Germany, they weren't allowed to take any cash. And so Helen Storrow was the bank, because it's the Great Depression. Banks are not going to lend a mortgage to this penniless German with weird ideas. So Helen Storrow is one of our heroines of our story. So we have the Gropiuses designing this very simple rectangular shape, so that shoebox shape we saw in Dessau. And it's actually a wood frame structure with a fieldstone foundation. I hope this is sounding familiar to your New England ears. And it's actually a riff on a center entrance colonial with a portico. And then it was actually a young man named Caspar Jenny from Concord, Massachusetts, who was open-minded enough and impressed with Gropius's grasp of materials and engineering and construction to go on this kind of odd journey. And his friends down the lumberyard were like, what is up? You are going to ruin your career. They drive by like, where's the roof? You know, that kind of stuff. But this house withstood the hurricane of 1938 without a scratch. So then he was like, yeah, so we're good. Feeling proud. So go ahead and change the slide. So here is the Gropius house. This is a beautiful springtime shot. It doesn't look like this today. It's mud season in March, but it's lovely in the spring. And so Gropius is looking at New England architecture through his Bauhaus lens of simplicity and functionality and economy. And very often he would take a traditional form, like a center entrance with a portico, and give it a twist. He'll take traditional New England building materials and give them a twist. But he would also incorporate non-traditional materials into the domestic setting. For example, the glass block wall here on this north elevation. Glass block was mass-produced in the 1930s, but primarily used as a commercial application. Gas stations, gymnasiums, hotel lobbies, that kind of thing. And so this was quite radical to take a commercial material and incorporate it. One of the things that Gropius was really thinking about in terms of building his home was replicatability. If you could buy your fixtures, your toilets, your doorknobs, your glass block in bulk, then you could replicate this very simple design and make it affordable. I'm going to point out one thing while we have it. We've got two trellises, east and west. One of the themes of the Gropius house, besides this synthesis of Bauhaus and New England, is the relationship of nature and architecture. And these trellises are going to figure into that conversation, but they also are an aesthetic property where it elongates what could be a very short little stubby kind of shoebox. So visually, he's giving us some elongation through those structures east and west. So go ahead and change that slide. Trellis, good. So part of what I like to talk about with regards to this relationship of nature and architecture is their what they called living in harmony with nature. And the landscape was as paramount of importance to Walter Gropius and Isa as the architectural structure itself. So the structure is actually defined by a retaining wall on the west, south, and east side, and by a slight berm across that north elevation. And it creates a plinth, which we saw, of course, before in Dessau. And it's also a separation between where they would cultivate and keep the lawn and the gardens tidy from how they treated Helen Storrow's formal apple orchard. They have about 4.5 acres of land to tend, and so one of the things they decided to do was to allow the apple orchard to be purely ornamental. I mean, they would gather apples to make sauce and stuff, but it wasn't like they were going to the farmer's market with bushels of apples anymore. And Gropius loved this nice little linear lineup of all these neat trees going across the meadow in this grid. But they would also allow the meadow to grow up naturally because they wanted to encourage low water, low maintenance gardening. It's now like a thing, wild space, letting your tall grass grow for wildlife and habitat. And so they were early proponents of that. So the next slide, please. And here is Mrs. Gropius sitting on that retaining wall with her home behind her. And here is their daughter, Ati Gropius, and their family cat sitting on the retaining wall on the west side. And right behind her head is the home of Marcel Breuer. Because Breuer came to teach at Harvard at the beckoning of Walter Gropius, and Helen Storrow loaned him the money to build his house as well. And he got a little less money because he was a bachelor at the time and built a smaller house. Next door to the Breuer house is the Walter Bogner house, another Harvard professor. His grandson is an architect, Eric, and he lives in his grandfather's house. I see you nodding, you know Eric. And then right across the street was the Fords, James Ford and his wife, Catherine Morrow Ford, both Harvard professors, and Breuer and Gropius together designed and assisted them with their home. So between 1938 and 1940, Helen Storrow basically formed a mid-century modern neighborhood. And she said she didn't know anything about modern architecture. Just if it's good, it's going to take root. So, okay, good on Helen, because it did. Next slide. So we're going to step through. We're going to walk through this front door here on the north elevation, and you can see this portico jutting out on this angle, cantilevered, again, just kind of leading your eye. It's the natural approach to the house from the garage below. And when we have our visitors, it literally, this is your first clue of where you're going to go, is come up to the front door, and it visually does that for us. So next slide, please. And when we step through, we're going to find the glass block has traveled from the exterior to the interior to allow natural light to permeate through into this entryway. Next slide, please. And we step through, I'm going to start here. So here's our front door. Step through into the hallway. Now, many of these photographs are kind of fisheye, so they're a little bit disingenuous in terms of scale. These are fairly small spaces. The photographs make them look a little grander than they really are. But part of what this really is a whole host of things going on in this hallway, and one of my favorite spaces of the house, because they use their home as a teaching tool. So this idea of New England and Bauhaus, the idea of nature and architecture, and this is where I'm going to introduce family function form, because how this family used these spaces really does, in fact, manifest here in their family home. So nature and architecture, we have beautiful warm cork floors underfoot. We've got our traditional New England clapboard. Done it in an unusual way where we've got it inside, hung vertically. That's because their friends were artists like Juan Miro or Alexander Shawinski, and they use this space as their changing art gallery. And so if you have a clapboard wall, which is wood, and how convenient, you hammer your nail, and when you want to move your art around, which they did, it patches and paints very easily. And so it's functional and attractive, and it has this beautiful texture. But I want you also to notice the verticality that's going on elsewhere in this space, because Gropius is resonating geometry throughout his space, where the chrome banisters are giving you this sort of verticality as well, and that moves your eye around in this space. So we've got kind of our three themes going on right here in this one entryway. So next slide, please. The Gropius house actually has the largest collection of original Bauhaus furniture anywhere outside of Germany. And we'll start here with this Breuer desk. You'll see that it's for Mr. and Mrs. Gropius, designed for specifically this collaborative pairing that they would work side by side. And they were able to bring their furniture out of Nazi Germany because they appealed to the director of propaganda for the Third Reich, and suggested that this was an example of German achievement, and they had to make an agreement while they were still in Europe to not speak out against the Nazi regime, an agreement they subsequently broke as soon as they got to the United States. And so they were able to return to Berlin and get their Bauhaus objects out. And of course, the Nazis didn't want any of this stuff anyway. So they were very lucky, and we're very lucky to have it still intact and in their family home. So any family home, you're going to buy new stuff and you're going to add it to your collection, and the Gropiuses did as well. They were friends with Eero Saarinen. So Saarinen, again, an architect, better known as an architect, designing furniture. Marcel Berner designing furniture, then becoming an architect. So this interdisciplinary interplay is going on. And one of the other little pieces of furniture there is from the Isokon years in London. So we'll go on to the next slide. Oh, before we do, back up one quick second. Lots of art in this house, and name-dropping art. These little Mexican figurines were given to them by Diego Rivera. So nice to have friends. They really, the art in this house really does represent friendships. It's a very personally meaningful art collection here in the Gropius house. So go to the next slide if you would. And again, it's kind of a wide angle lens. We're stepping through the study into the main part of the living room. It's an L shape. And again, we've got that Saarinen chair. That's an icon of mid-century modern, the womb chair here. And we've got lots and lots of Breuer chrome furniture. He was inspired by the handlebars of his Adler bicycle. Like, okay, so you can make handlebars and they curve, so let's play around with that. And Gropius is thinking about just creating a simple cube and then flipping it and then adding more tubular steel. So we've got tables, chairs, other kinds of very simple, affordable structures in terms of furnishings. And so part of what is important about these is not only functional and affordable, but also porous. The idea that your eye can travel under, over, and around this furniture, imagine it as big, chunky, blocky wood furniture. And then suddenly you don't have this sense of spaciousness and air. The other thing about this room is that the scale of things is quite low. The sill is knee-high. The tallest thing is the Saarinen chair, which is about hip height. The lighting is hip height or lower, so a very low horizon space. And so what that does for us, of course, is to allow us to really engage with the outside view. So the south-facing windows here really are engaging, and over what would be the west-facing window would be over my right shoulder that way. And so we've got this interplay between indoors and outdoors, and I know that that's a tack feature as well, or a deck feature as well. There's an exterior door here, and so the front door and the back door are on one access point. Another door here, there's a door in the study, and even these large plate glass windows have side vents, so they could open up the house to cool it by passive ventilation. Gropius was also experimenting with materials, as I say, non-traditional materials, and this is actually not concrete on the interior walls, it's acoustic plaster. So he's really interested in designing with the intangible qualities of light and air and sound. So we'll go on to the next slide. Right on cue, here's the sunlight coming through. And again, nature and architecture. So they are very deliberately curated by the family, plants and wool and texture and fuzzy, fur coverings and shells and those kinds of things. Next slide, please. And this is a view from the dining room back toward that living room area and the fireplace. And we've got lots of Breuer furniture around this dining room table. And you're getting just a glimpse of the glass block wall used as an interior structure here. And the next slide. So these little salt and pepper shakers are like, this big. They're adorable. But the light streaming through and the idea of this opacity of light, allowing light to come into the center of the home. So literally like thinking about the intangible qualities, thinking about cast shadow. These are all very deliberate choices that they're making. And we'll go on to the next slide. It's awesome at night. Come for an evening program because we'll give you wine and cheese and access to the stories and the stuff that you don't get to see on the normal tour. Anyway, this is a little preview. So not only are they thinking about natural light daytime, but they're thinking about designing the light in a very dramatic way. And you can see there's a spotlight actually in the ceiling that sends this cone of light down to the dining room table. It almost creates kind of an ellipse or an eclipse there on the floor. Very much about gathering around the center table, having one conversation, having this intimacy of gathering. Now, they would actually throw parties for larger crowds from May to September, literally taking the furniture out with them through the door, out the screen porch to the patio and elsewhere, so they could set up buffet. But we have it set as a sort of formal, intimate gathering for 4 people. Go ahead with the next slide. Just another view of the gloaming. So the light outside is this cool blue, and inside is looking warm and inviting. Next slide, please. And here they are, having lobster. So if you haven't cottoned on yet, the palette of the Gropius house is black, white, gray, touches of chrome, touches of glass, and some warmth from the wool carpet, which is sort of a walnut brown, and some of the natural materials. But this is like this cool color-coordinated meal. White, black, with touches of boiled lobster. So there's Walter, Isa, their daughter Ati, and a couple of cousins enjoying a toast. So go ahead and change that slide again. So we move from the dining room through into the kitchen. The kitchen was not meant as a gathering space. It was not meant for company to come in and hang out. It was built for one woman, their housekeeper cook named Gertrude. And it's based on a design Gropius was very familiar with called the Frankfurt kitchen. Now, MoMA actually owns a sample Frankfurt kitchen, and I believe is on view occasionally in New York. And the Frankfurt kitchen was one that moved away from large spaces for multiple servants of the Victorian era to efficient one-person, minimizing steps, minimizing the triangle of work. So your prep top, your cooktop, and your sink. It also divided food preparation from dish cleanup, and Gropius does the same. But we've got this beautiful east-facing window, lots of natural light coming in again. Go ahead and change that slide. It's really nostalgic when people come to visit, like, oh, that's my Nana's mixer. So it's very, recent history for us. And you can see here the food preparation is the far end. There's a swinging door, black linoleum kind of gleaming, and then the pantry area is about dish cleanup and storage. And should you be coming for a party from the front door to the back, they would pull this little plastic gray shower curtain across so you didn't see the dirty dishes in the sink. Now, I am a frugal New Englander, and this is just the coolest thing in the house. It's like the cheapest thing that you can think of for a room divider. Put up a shower curtain, and then Mrs. Gropius actually trimmed and hemmed it just so it just fit perfectly. Love that. Go ahead and change that slide. So we're back out into this hallway. We're going to ascend this staircase. And one of the things about the Bauhaus was that artists would bring their design eye to everyday objects to make them affordable and beautiful. And in this space, our utilitarian handrail really becomes this beautiful graphic line in space. It's almost rhythmic in this space. It kind of has this, it's kind of like jazzy. So we're going to head up and change the slide to the top of the staircase. I'm sorry that the handrail is sort of blocking our Joseph Albers at the top of the stair. But so again, they're using the interior hallway as a changing art gallery, both upstairs and down. So go ahead and change it one more time. And here is Walter standing at the top of his own staircase. And go ahead and change it one more time again. And there's a group of students enjoying themselves in the Gropius house as well. Go ahead and change it one more time. Look at that. I mean, like interior sculpture. Pretty awesome. And a beautiful glow from the cork and the verticality. Okay, keep on trucking. There we go. So we'll step into one of the 3 bedrooms up here on the second floor, and that is the Mr. and Mrs. Gropius's bedroom and bath and dressing room. Now, the Gropiuses lived in a way that I think many of us can relate to, which is they like to sleep with their windows open, even in the winter, with a little crack of fresh air. That would be me. And so Gropius wanted to create 2 separate heating zones. So he builds a wall, but he builds a wall using glass and reflective surfaces so your eye can travel through. So if you're standing on this side and you're looking through at the dressing table, you can see how the window is picked up in the mirror and it feels like you could put your arm through physical space. So he's creating these kinds of illusions of spaciousness. Go ahead with the next slide if you would. Again, in the next room, which is, we're still in the master, but from the sleeping quarters, we're seeing this, again, frugal, love this frugality, this kind of interesting way of creating a place to hang art, just literally strapping from the lumber yard attached to your plaster wall so you can, hang a twig or a photograph or a little art piece from a friend. So, and again, the natural light streaming in. So this is very interesting to me because the scale and the pace and the size is very reflective of what's happening, and it makes this sort of visual connectedness to even the curtains in the window. Mrs. Gropius also liked to shop at Design Research, so you may know Ben and James Thompson brought Design Research to Cambridge. He was a member of TAC, and they were good customers. Next slide, please. So this is the guest room, and there's the Breuer chair from the 1920s in the Bauhaus in Dessau, Breuer desk, Breuer bed, alto vase. There's Juan Miró on the wall, but really none of those are as important as what the Gropiuses valued themselves, and that is they kept a guest book all their lives, and it's the who's who of the 20th century. Frank Lloyd Wright, of course, came to visit. Igor and Vera Stravinsky slept in these twin beds toe-to-toe. Alexander Calder, Toko Shinoda, all their Bauhaus friends would come back for reunions. And so it's really this really cool and interesting document, this tiny little book with quotes and photographs pasted in and notes and Neutra and, oh my goodness, I don't even know who, just lots and lots of folks came to sign and stayed in this very modest little guest room. So next slide. All right, we've moved into Ati's bedroom. Now, Ati gets the best real estate in the whole house up here on the second floor. She was 13 when they built the house, so hers is an L-shaped bedroom where she's got a workspace. Right behind that desk out of the view of the photograph is a little day bed. And we're going to turn the corner and hit the next slide to see her little sleeping nook. So she's got, a place to hang out and read, to have a sleepover with a friend. She's got her father's Weimar desk from the Bauhaus to work on, built-in closets. She's got some cool art on her walls. And then when she feels like going outside, next slide, please, she gets the roof deck. Yeah, I know. That's a big So Ati was enrolled at Concord Academy as a day student, so every day she'd nip out, get on her bike, and ride past Walden Pond to Main Street and Concord Academy, and bring her friends home. So Ati had 3 wishes about what she wanted in her family home. She wanted to sleep out under the stars. Check. She wanted her own separate entrance. That spiral staircase on the north elevation is hers. Check. She wanted a sand floor. Thanks for playing. No way are you getting sand in the house. But she gets this beautiful play space with basically, proper wood flooring. But what I would love to show you here, and I'm sure you're kind of already sensing it and seeing it, is this play of light, this play of texture. It's still the exterior cladding is this vertical clapboard, in this case painted pink. This is a color that Lionel Feininger actually at the Bauhaus mixed, and they use that at the Bauhaus in Germany. So they incorporate it here in their own home. But you can see the cast shadows are just so dramatic and so beautiful. And we'll hit the slide again. Ati was an artist, an author, a powerful advocate for the modern movement. She was really the living memory for us at the Gropius house. When Mrs. Gropius decided to donate the house and their personal possessions to SPANEA, the Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities, is that sounding familiar to anybody? Good, okay, good. Thank goodness we've changed our name to Historic New England. It's short and sweet, and way shorter than on the email chain. And she lived in the house. She decided to make that, she made that decision in 1978. So Gropius died in 68. She made the decision to continue his legacy of using their home as a teaching tool in 1978, but then lived on until 1983. So the implication of that is our archivists, our educators, our curators work directly with Mrs. Gropius on the meaning and the placement of things in their home and the process of building. And then Ati supplemented us with her memories. And then her daughter, Erica, continues to supplement with her memories as well. Although her memories are from, knee high. And she remembers Großpapa and Großmama and tells lovely stories about her experiences in the house. So this is the view from Ati's roof deck looking down toward the screen porch and the landscape. And you can get a sense of the retaining wall here on the south elevation and sort of the tidiness of the landscape immediately surrounding the house. And go ahead and change that slide again. Excellent. This was originally built as an open pavilion with just the floor and the ceiling and the lally columns, but they realized in order to enjoy it, they needed to screen it in because y'all know that the mosquitoes are the size of aircraft carriers out here. So when they did the screen, you can see it here, well, sort of, Mrs. Gropius designed a garden bed. And there were these arches already that they established to draw your eye out as a framing device. So they're literally leftover lally columns in a 2x4 painted gray. And that was to draw your out into the landscape to sort of extend and create this almost virtual next sort of visual space, this rectangle. So after a trip to Japan, Mrs. Gropius was inspired by what she saw, and she's also getting to the point where, you know, that gardener's knee kind of was getting the better of her, so she wanted to simplify. This was, in fact, like a cottage garden of tulips and perennials and, you know, more high-maintenance stuff. So she pulled it all out and installed a very simple, low-horizon, gray gravel bed with cotton Easter, candy tuft, pink azalea, and a red aster maple as the focal point, and it just was easier to keep, but it was also in confluence with their simple gardening philosophy. And it's quite lovely in May. Next slide, please. And here is Mr. and Mrs. Gropius enjoying breakfast because the sun is coming in from the east side on their screen porch. This was a porch they really used year-round. Next slide, please. So today, we continue the tradition of inviting artists and others in for celebration, for education and interpretation. And folks just love, we can't sit in the Breuer chairs, they're a little too fragile, but we like to scoot down and see how the light is reflected off of the white Formica table onto the faces surrounding it. And everyone's like, you look so good. So go ahead and change the slide if you would. Here we go. Gropius House became a showcase for Bauhaus design. Architects and students came to study. Isa left the house to us in 1979 to continue teaching the principles of the Bauhaus movement. And that's what we continue to do today. So next slide, I think, is, night-night. We do evening programs and tours. It's really worth coming to see it at night. It's a different experience. It's beautiful, and we're lucky to be set in the, conservation land surrounding us here in Lincoln, Massachusetts. And I think the next slide is just all historic New England. Oh, no goody. So 2019 was a good year. Remember 2020, not so good. So 2019 was the centennial celebration of the anniversary of the founding of the Bauhaus. And so we created an interactive web app that is still up there today. You can go and play on it. Isa gives a tour on it. And then that came in really handy in 2020 because shutdown. So we are continuing to regain ground that we lost from the COVID shutdown and other kind of catastrophes with more activities, more programs, open, almost back to normal hours. And but this is a great way of experiencing the house if you just have a minute to get on your phone. So I think that's all for me. Yep, it is. So thank you all very much. So we'll do a Q&A after. And so, hold on to your questions if you have them.
Thanks. I very recommend going on the evening tour. I have been on it, and it's phenomenal. And it's very small, and you get a much more intimate experience at the thing. There we go. So, I'm going to talk about. I'm an architect who researches much more the provenance of where the ideas came from and who influenced who. So I'm going to go even further back than Wendy into 1909 when Gropius was working for Peter Behrens, who is considered the grandfather of modern architecture. This is the AEG factory. It was built in 1911, I think it's when it opened, in Berlin. And the interesting thing is that both Mies van der Rohe and Gropius were working together on this design. So their influence, their connection started a lot earlier than just at the Bauhaus. So Gropius in 1909 came out with this idea about having some sort of prototype of houses that you could have. So they were different sizes for different needs. And his objectives were aimed at improving the quality of design and construction, because he was already looking at prefabrication and the greater economy of cost. Because if you prefabricate, hopefully it's cheaper because you're in factories. It all comes from the motor car, as we were talking about earlier, and Ford. So if we go to the next slide. The star architects from the Bauhaus were Walter Gropius, as we've been talking about, Mies van der Rohe, who I will mention later as well, and Marcel Breuer. Now, all these architects ended up in America. Mies van der Rohe ended up being the director of IIT in Chicago and designed the architecture school there. If you go to the next slide. Now, Gropius was actually very key in getting a lot of architects out of Europe during World War II. And it wasn't just people from the Bauhaus. Now, he met this young man, Wachmann. He was a young architect. He knew of Gropius, but they both happened to be photographing the same building in Prague and started chatting and became friends. And Wachmann was also interested in this mechanization of trying to make, factory building houses, and was working on this while he was moving around Europe trying to stay safe. He was in Italy for a while, and then finally he ended up in the south of France, and Gropius sponsored his visa to get to the US. So if you've ever watched, I think it's called Paradise Hotel on Netflix or Amazon, that is exactly, he was the person that got the visas, sponsoring people through. And when Wachmann arrived in Massachusetts, Gropius put him up. He made sure he had money, and he also mentored him to create this new system called the package house, which went into production. Unfortunately, it was too difficult for the mass producers to build at that point in time, and was eventually sold to a company in California. I think they built 8,000 of the houses, but they too didn't financially succeed and finally folded. So you go to the next slide. Marcel Breuer was also looking into how can we house the masses. In fact, a lot of our architects were looking at this. They had a housing crisis then too. And he was, in 1942, he was looking into similar sort of plans. Are very, very, notice there's very little circulation on the Yankee Portables site. And the Place 2 Point house actually means it has only 2 points. There's only 2 columns that reach the ground, so they have minimal foundations. It's almost like an aircraft, if you notice how the beams work. But the other interesting thing about this house was it was meant to be coated with plastic. So they were obviously all looking at new materials and what were the new materials we could use. It never went into production, by the way, but it's just such an amazing thing. And if you notice, it really sits very, obviously, 2 points 2 points for foundations. It sort of hovers in the landscape, so it can be built on a sloping site. I will come back to that later. And then, obviously, look at the very slight roof. Very, very small pitched roof. It's talking about using the minimum amount of materials to build houses. If you go to the next slide. Now, Mies van der Rohe was in Illinois, and he built the Farnsworth House in 1952. It's all walls of glass house. Mies wasn't really looking into panelized construction as much as the other architects were. He was much more about how minimal materials you could use, but his materials were exquisite, I might add. If anyone's visited the Barcelona house, the pavilion in Barcelona, it's just unbelievable. Marble walls and all the rest. But also on the other side of America, in California, Charles and Ray Eames were looking into prefabrication. And this is a house they designed, their own house. They designed it before World War II, but because of the limit of getting materials, they couldn't construct it till after the war. Now, why am I showing you this? Well, because here in Carlisle, if we go to the next slide, we have our own glass block house on plinths. This is David Boardman's house. It's on Russell Street. It's been published by the architect who renovated it, and it has 2-inch thick walls, by the way, which are the walls that aren't glass, already 2-inch thick. It's really interesting. If you, I would love it. I've been on it when it was an open house. I'd love it if it was an open house again. If we go to the next slide. So I'll talk about Gropius later, but we have Mies van der Rohe, another pioneer of modern architecture, according to Nicolas Pevsner, was Le Corbusier. Well, he was, Jean Renier worked for Le Corbusier in Paris, but he actually realized that the writing was on the wall, being Jewish, and so he was lucky enough to get an international fellowship to Harvard in 1936, came over here, and he, if you look at what he wanted to build, it's almost very similar to everything that Gropius was talking about compact, green, walkable. This is all stuff we're doing now, harmonized with its natural setting and to be attractive. I thought the interesting thing was 32-hour week shifts. I thought that was a good one. But he was working in Massachusetts. He lived in Brookline. This is a house of his that he designed in Brookline. And he also produced a series of magazines where you could buy the blueprints for $15. So, and he designed modern houses, but he also designed, in fact, any style you wanted. He was his design there. But he was also thinking about how do I get housing to the masses in a different way. And we go to the next slide. And this is our Jean Renier house in Massachusetts, in Carlisle. It's on Cross Street. And the same year he built this house, he also published another booklet for houses, and he had an idea about the kitchen, the importance of the kitchen. And the most interesting thing about all his points was it's to do with the housewife. And I thought the last point was a bit sad. A window to the back gives her more privacy, but it may also increase her hours of loneliness when the children and husband are away from the house. Exactly, I know. And the interesting thing is, when you actually, if you check him out, it's his wife that comes up on Wikipedia. She was a very well-known psychologist, very well published. So I was just sort of, there must have been very interesting conversations in that household. That's all I can think of. We go to the next slide. So, well, the other pioneer of modern architecture is Frank Lloyd Wright. And lo and behold, we have a disciple of Frank Lloyd Wright's house also in Carlisle, and it's the Fay Jones house. It's called the Fay Jones, who was from Arkansas. His only house that he's designed in Massachusetts is here. It's the River House, and it was built in 1984. Now, there is a beautiful picture that is owned by the Boston Globe, if you can go and look it up. There was copyright issues, so I had to do a sketch. So I apologize for the roughing. But I want you to notice the horizontal lines, the deck, the overhang, the shadows. I think anyone who lives in a deck house will find all this elevation very, very familiar. We go to the next slide. So now I'm going to go back to Gropius. And as Wendy mentioned, he set up TAC, the Architects Collaborative, with some of his graduate students. And interesting enough, 2 of the graduate students were women. So it was a mixed gender office right from the beginning. And they were architects and developers, which many architects were post-war. And so they were looking at how can we create, because they're the developers, they're the ones funding this, how do we create houses that are flexible, that will suit people, that they can stay in, they can grow with, the house can grow with their family. And this is their second one after they had done their houses for their own development at Six Moon. Is it Moon Hill? Six Moon Hill, yeah. And this is 5 Fields. And this one, you can see the house. This would, you'd start off with your small house and the 2 extensions. And then as your family grew, you could very easily add on to your house, which seems like an excellent idea. But the thing that they also had is you could choose from the post and beam framing, because these are the posts, you could choose what windows you wanted, whether you wanted an all glass wall or you wanted an all wood wall, wood paneled wall. You could sliding doors or you could have windows. So each panel could be changed as you wanted to suit your site or your needs, or your budget, actually, because the glass was probably more than the wood. We go to the next slide. So TAC were at 42 Brattle Street, and at 44 Brattle Street was Core House. And Edward Kutera, he was obviously, he'd worked for TAC. He was obviously directly influenced by the design of the Core 10 houses and created these core houses. Now we have a number of these in Carlisle, and obviously there's a whole series of them on East Riding Drive. And the great thing is they were called core houses because they had the central utility core and then the open plan living around that, and the back wing was the bedrooms. You go to the next slide. And the original cost was $12,000. A wee bit more now. And this is one of the detail of the construction of a core house. And as you can see, there is no insulation on the roof, and there is no basement. That was the typical core house. And I've been going around Carlisle looking through the woods and trying to find out which other houses are core houses, because only the ones on East Riding Drive are actually registered with the state. So there's a house on West Street. Now, Jenny, who lives there, actually contacted me today, so hopefully I'll get more information about that. This is what I do. I just go out and sort of like try and find out more information. We go to the next slide. There's 2 story core houses. There is the one on School Street, and there is another one on East Riding Drive. And they have slightly different plans because they've got 2 stories. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see the interior of this one. You have a very long, the kitchen's at the end. It's not in the middle of the house. And this is another house that is on Cross Street, which looks just like a core house. But it's got the date of 1971 as a built date, which seems a bit late. If you go to the next slide. So this is the house on both sides. You can see it's an H-shape plan because that's one elevation, that's the other one. And so I'm pretty sure this is a core house, and it would be really interesting to find out why it was constructed much later, if it was, or is that an error in our assessor's database? Most of these photographs come from the assessors, by the way, or from when the houses are being sold. If you go to the next slide. So I'm going back to the other main player in Massachusetts at the time when it came to house design, and that was Carl Koch. And he was also educated at Harvard, but then went off to research house production in Sweden, came back, taught at MIT, and then started his practice in 1939 with this development at Snake Hill. And again, he was the architect developer. Now, just to give you an idea, his office was at 55 Brattle Street. in Cambridge. So you've got three main firms working in right next to each other. Massachusetts, and especially Brattle Street, was a hub for house design in the 1940s and 50s. You go to the next slide. Now, one of his people that he taught was Walter Pierce. Walter Pierce is famous for his developments mainly in Lexington, where he developed architect-developer. He developed Peacock Farm in 1951. Now, the interesting thing about the top photograph is that that house has the identical plan to a deck house. So they're all the architects are looking at minimizing circulation space. Split level, minimize, because then you have to go down 4 feet for frost protection for your foundations in Massachusetts. So you've already got half of a basement built. You might as well just put the other rooms in the basement and then have the living spaces upstairs. So that is why the split level evolved. It was a very efficient way of using space you had to build anyway. Walter Pierce is also famous as being a very modern architect. This is his hill house, also known as the Knives Out house. It was in the movie, Knives Out. Originally it was painted brown. You can see how it suddenly looks like it's a bit more like the Gropius house when they painted it white. We go to the next house. Now, Walter Pierce is also more famous for the asymmetrical roof and actually going into tri-level houses. And I've sort of been, as I say, wandering around Carlisle to see where that influence came in. And we have a house here in Rutland Street that isn't the same because it doesn't have the same triangular glazing as the Walter Pierce house, but maybe it was influenced by him. And there is also another, I think it's probably only a 2-level house, but on Blaisdell, it's an asymmetrical roof. But built around the same time, 1957, 1958. So this all was happening here. If you go to the next slide. Going back to Carl Koch, why was he very influential? Well, obviously he had some backing from the government because he was working for the National Housing Agency. He then did his Snake Hill development. The war happened, and he became a monuments man, as in the movie, The Monuments Man. He went over and saved the architecture in Europe during World War II. He came back and developed the first Acorn House in Concord, and that's a top photograph. It obviously didn't survive, but that was a very simple house, very similar to what Marcel Breuer were doing and what Gropius was doing. There's then various other house designs. A Lustron house is a metal house. Again, they're looking at new materials that could be used. That didn't happen. And then he started looking at Canantum. And he started Canantum before he established TechBuilt. So Canantum was the place he tried out the ideas and found out what worked to build a house that could be easily built and from the back of a truck, basically. If you go to the next slide. So he established TechBuilt houses in 1953, and it's a post and beams construction. It came on a flatbed truck, and it only cost $7.25 per square feet. He was amazing at marketing. He was on the TV. They showed how quickly a house of his could be built with a time lapse, and it became very, very popular. If you go to the next slide. But he was very particular about who he wanted. He didn't want people who wanted to live in colonials. He wanted modern people to come and live in his house. So again, you can notice in the plan, minimal circulation space, using as much of the building as he can. And he had the beams running the wrong way, as I always say, because they run the length of the building, not across the building. Don't quite know what that was going on there, but again, it was built on a 4-foot centers. Anyway, it'd be interesting. I have to go and talk to some structural engineers to compare the two. We go to the next slide. So do we have tech-built houses in Carlisle? This is the closest one I've come to find, but it's not quite the same. On the end elevation, the paneling isn't the same. And then it also has deck house features, like it has the roof. It has the beams going the same way as a tech house, but the roof is lock deck, the same as deck houses. So, and this one has had, I don't know whether this was retrofitted, but it now has a deck house step and the waffle door of a deck house. So, don't know. In 1965, it would be very early for a deck house. 1964 were the first ones built in Carlisle. So this is one of these houses that, or maybe it's somebody else. You know, maybe it's somebody at 66 Brattle Street. Don't know. Anyway, go to the next slide. Also being built at the same time in Carlisle were the holiday houses. This has got nothing to do with vacations. It's actually got to do with Mr. Holiday, who was the developer. He wasn't the developer. What was he? The owner? No, he was the something. He was the person behind this, anyway. Because you said the developer was somebody else. Sorry. We have our original holiday house resident here. Again, you can see, if anyone knows a deck house, look at that plan. Doesn't that look familiar? Living room, dining room, kitchen, breakfast area. I mean, in a deck house, it'd be very similar. Central fireplace. And this one, they did have the garage underneath. But yeah, and you can see it's the same thing. But you see the triangular windows at the ends, like the Walter Pierce houses? So you can see that the influences of everybody's, I think, influencing everyone else. All these were published. Magazines abound, you know. There is a very dangerous website called US Modernist that actually you can look at all the magazines from the 1950s, 60s, 70s. For architecture, and it actually has a health warning attached to it, saying don't go down this rabbit hole. Anyway, so that you can see that everyone's being influenced by each other. If you go to the next slide. So deck house. Deck house was started in Wayland in somebody's garage, like Apple. Well, no, in 1959. This was the very first sketch of the first prototype that was built. Which I have been to a house that had the posts at 9-foot centers. They then reduced them to 8-foot centers because obviously plywood comes in 4x8 lengths. You don't need to cut so much. So they were built in Wayland and Sudbury were the two first prototype houses. However, this house became, it was actually, as a house designer, the publication you have to have a house published in is Architectural Records House, Record House edition that comes out in May. And a deck house was actually published there in 1964. So there is some sort of architectural kudos to living in a deck house. We have the most number of deck houses in the world in our town. They're Wolf Rock Road, which is the first one in 1964, Indian Hill and Indian Hill Road, Judy Farm, Berry Corner, and Heald Road were all built at the same time. And then later on, the Norwell Farm, I should have missed out an E from Norwell Farm Road, and then Stonygate, and then Canterbury Court. And then after that, if you notice, one of the things I've noticed is many, like Indian Hill and Heald Road, Judy Farm, they're all sloping sites. And as DEC owned the land, I wondered whether, you know, sloping sites are cheaper usually to buy because they're more difficult to develop. So I wondered if the deck house was deliberately one of the ways they developed the deck house to have the bathroom and the utility room in the part of the basement that's not a walkout, was so they could actually get the best bang for their buck. If you go to the next slide. So this is a typical early deck house plan. You can see you have the entranceway. There is very little circulation space at all, so no wasted space. Everything is rigid on those 8 feet centers. It has a large overhang that protects the windows in the summer, so you don't get so much solar gain, because they have orientated the south side. Well, not every house, because of course once I said this, in October, everybody said, well, that house isn't. But most of the houses, if you look up on Heald Road, certainly, are orientated to the south. They're slightly off, so they're not all one after the other, but so they're bringing in the principles from Gropius to have solar gain. They use lock deck, which is a 3-inch thick timber structural decking for the roof, so they minimize the amount of lumber you're using. They use panelized construction, which is rather than prefab. That means only the 4x8 panels are delivered, so it goes back to the core house and to tax core 10 house. The same idea, so you could choose the panel that you wanted. For instance, in our house, the windows and the basement are slightly lower than you'll see in other houses. Other deck houses have higher windows in their walkout basement. So you could choose, every person could choose to tweak their own design a little bit. Mahogany windows, mahogany door. So it was a higher spec of finish than you would see in a tech-built house. So they were going after a slightly different clientele. They were trying to make themselves different that way. You go to the next thing. So this takes me back to the Frank Lloyd Wright, the Fay Jones house. When you see the horizontal roof, the same as in Fay Jones's house, the shadows. The overhang creates this shadow, so you very much have a horizontality within the design. And obviously the connection between the indoors and outdoors with the walls of glass, it goes straight back to Gropius. You go to the next slide. So I think we all, those of us that live in deck houses know the features. But one of my friends, when I was from the UK, he's a professor of architecture, he came and stayed, and he goes, oh, wow, this is Mies van der Rohe meets Frank Lloyd Wright with the prefab principles of Walter Gropius. I'm just going to say there are a few problems with deck houses, leaky door, the leaky doors, the wall, they had to use aluminium doors. They didn't put the right kind of detailing under them, so we've all had to do work to them and replace them with wood windows. So there were a few faults because they were pushing technology and the availability of materials in the thing. And also, you fall down the stairs, it's a bit narrow when you fall down. When you open the door, there's not much of a hallway, and lots of people have added hallways when they've to their houses. So if I'm going to go, the next few slides are about Carlisle and the other houses that I don't know much about and I'd love to learn more about. So we go to the next slide. So this is what the number of houses that were constructed in Carlisle in the big growth period by style. This is taken from the assessor's database. And as you can see, if you add deck house and contemporary together, that was the biggest style that was actually being constructed in Carlisle in those 40-year period, that 40-year period. And that's 1,101 houses. So that's a lot of houses out of 1,750 that we have now. So we go to the next slide. These are the other houses that I have very little information about, and I would love to get more information, because I think the one thing we have is we often talk about Carlisle and our conservation land, and we don't talk about our architectural heritage. And we are unique. We probably have the biggest collection of core houses, we know we have the biggest collection of deck houses, and we have some other unique houses that we don't know about. So 1960s Log Hill, the owners did say that they think the architect was also connected to Frank Lloyd Wright in some way. Sorry, the Pagebrook Road, that's not Pagebrook Road, that's Rutland Street, and that's Pagebrook Road. Got them the wrong way around just to confuse everyone. But there are houses that are very different and very unique here. If you go to the next slide. This is another one that just sold recently. The realtor's information said it was by a renowned Vermont architect. I don't know who that architect is. I'd love to know. But what's interesting is this really embodies passive solar because they have a sort of little internal greenhouse between the outside and the inside of the actual living space, which is very interesting. And the roof overhang is very different. Let me go to the next slide. So these are the other houses that we have very little information about. You know, who designed which house? Is this a version of this house? I don't know. And the last slide is next. And these are the only 4 houses that we can consider modern, like influenced by mid-century modern houses, have been built in Carlisle in the last 24 years. It's interesting because, you know, we've had an issue with our assessments and valuations in Carlisle because the deck house assessments, deck houses are selling for a lot of money now. And apparently, you know, people want to live in mid-century modern houses, but we're still not actually building what people appear to be wanting. It's very interesting. Again, I would love more information. If you have information, please share it with me. I think that we can collectively record our history here. It's a really important thing to do, especially as, you know, as things change and we need to maybe consider looking at what we need to do to save this part of Carlisle's history. So thank you very much. Okay, any questions?
You kind of skipped over my house, and when you first mentioned it, I was so shocked in the first presentation that my house was up there on East Running Drive. But you mentioned then that it's less expensive for the sloped site. And one of the miracles of my poor house is that downstairs, as you've stated, the bathroom and the heat room are all downstairs underground, sort of. So the pipes go out, and I turn my heat off when I work in Boston to this day. I just turn my heat off all day. And it's fine because the pipes are coming out well underground. I mean, they're like 6 feet under. So I feel really fortunate for that, you know, particular aspect.
Sorry, because it's been recorded. It's been recorded, so that's why I'm passing it.
So first question is, there's probably some old timers in this room who can answer some of the questions of who owned those houses when they were built. But I do have a question on, you mentioned Frank Lloyd Wright, and I was wondering, what is the intersection of what these people you spoke about did versus Frank Lloyd Wright, who influenced whom, and also where does Acorn fit in this?
That's a long question. I'm sorry. So Frank Lloyd Wright also was looking into housing for the masses with Usonian houses. So he was also and he was incredibly influential, both in America, obviously. He was also very good at promoting himself, and also in Europe. He produced many, because he was so good at promoting himself. He had a publication in 1911, which is known as the publication that introduced him to Europe. So he also had the thing about connecting with nature. Now, something that every time hear Wendy's talk, something else comes to mind. And when you were talking about the screens that go out onto the landscape, and that is Japanese architecture, 100%. And Japan opened up to the West. And so there is that whole influence of, suddenly Japanese architecture being published everywhere, becoming very, very popular. That influenced an awful lot of these people, because they would have been, it was just before the turn of the century that everything was opened up to Japan. And all the magazines were there. Frank Lloyd Wright went and built a hotel there. There was a lot. So there is a connection, and Japan probably, I don't know, Wendy, do you think Japan is the connection between the connection of landscape?
Yeah, it definitely is. We know for a fact that Gropius always acknowledged Frank Lloyd Wright as an early influence due to those publications that were sent over to Europe. And the connection to Japan for the Gropiuses actually comes a bit later, when cultural exchange and education exchanges occurred after World War II, and commerce and opened back up as well. Gropius was very active in the rebuild, not only in Japan but also in Europe, thinking about the devastation that occurred during the war. So, and they personally were drawn to what they found on their travels in Japan. And so, while the Gropius house, if you remember that the lally columns and the 2x4 at the end of the garden, it is evocative of kind of a Torii Gate Japanese influence. It wasn't intended that way, but then, when they kind of got home, they embraced that idea. But certainly the low horizon roof lines on Zimmerman House, for example, Frank Lloyd Wright, and of course the Usonian. In terms of Walter Gropius and his relationship to Japanese architecture, he was really a mentor and allowed his architectural principles to transcend time and place and allow other people, clients, students, colleagues, other architects, to define for themselves what simplicity and functionality and beauty really meant. So he hated the word style, actually. So, but influence and integration and synthesis were kind of his words. Hope that answers the question.
There was another question, an add-on about acorn houses. And so Acorn, obviously, were in Concord and then in Acton. And I'm not as knowledgeable about acorn houses, apart from when you look at the interiors of acorn houses, they have that double height space, and they're orientated to the sun the same way as deck houses. It's very interesting, especially when you look at the contemporary houses in Carlisle, and you can see influences of acorn on other houses and when you look at the interiors, but I couldn't necessarily say that is an acorn house. And one of the things, many things on my to-do list, is to contact Deck House, and who now own Acorn, and actually see what they have in their archives for Carlisle, because they're very good at telling us how many deck houses there are in Carlisle, but we haven't heard about Acorn yet. So, anyway, is there somebody else have a question?
I know one Acorn house for me. It's on Carl Pines Drive at the very end on the left, and it was owned by the Spences.
All right.
And I think that was put up in the 70s, but that's definitely an Acorn house.
Right. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot. There's one on Nathan Lane. I mean, they're all over the place. There's School Street. Didn't seem to be completed as a development like Deck House were. The president of Acorn, not the president. So, sorry.
So I can help you with the Orchard Acres house. That's the Adams family. I went to school with the daughter and the son. And the father came back from Vietnam War and had that house built. He loved where it was situated on kind of like the hill. And so I don't know. I I think there's some influence of deck house there, but I'm not sure. I just messaged her to find out.
That's exactly
And
what we need.
I'll let you know.
It's like crowdfunding, but crowdsourcing
Yeah.
our history. That's what I really need.
There is an interesting house. I take my daughter to tutoring on Bingham Road, right off of Concord Road.
Yes.
And it's up on a hill with a
It's
lot
a
of
ranch.
windows. Yes.
Yes, exactly. And it hovers again. Yes.
And I don't know if that's a tech house or,
It looks completely different inside, so
Yeah.
I don't know. That's another one that is definitely on the list of
yeah.
who designed it.
And you go by it at night, it's just stunning with the lights, as many of these houses are.
Can you ask them if they have any information?
Debbie mentioned passive solar a couple of times, but it seems like a lot of the mid-century modern houses were built without much consideration for energy conservation, and did that not happen until the 1970s when all of a sudden we started having more expensive petroleum products, or what? Okay.
So in the first deck houses, insulation was optional. It was like $300 extra to have 3.5 inches of fiberglass insulation, and I'm really glad we bought one of those houses with the extra insulation. But yeah, no, it was an optional. And again, the insulation on the roof was cork originally, which obviously had a lot of problems with termites and things like that. So yeah, they weren't. Yeah, energy was cheap. You know, so it was, and it wasn't, you know, nobody had considered, oh, these are all oil at that point in time. There wasn't much gas in the town, so they're oil. Never concerned about, you know, carbon emissions. Didn't mean anything. So, but they were. I mean, they realized that. I think they realized that sun was good for you, and also that we now know from all the research that if you people that can look out of hospital windows and see greenery will leave a hospital 2 days early than people that have no view. So we know that there is a value to being able to see the greenery. So yes, there is. That was sort of, somebody had worked that bit out without actually putting the money value to it, but now we know that that is an important thing. But yeah, no, insulation wasn't. Even Frank Lloyd Wright houses weren't insulated. What's that? Insulation. That's what sweaters are for. And blankets. Anyway, is there any other questions? Okay. All right. Do you want to close?
I just want to thank everybody for coming. We welcome you to the Carlisle Historical Society at the Heald House. So we're open the third Sunday of each month from 2 to 5. And come see us there.